you because I've been criticized for using the same adjectives over and over again. So I was sort of challenged and I said, you know what, this time around, when you ask me such a question, I'm going to reply by saying I am simple, easy, and awesome.
That's the way to go, Shaka. A warm welcome to all our Facebook followers and the people who broadcast us live in Ethiopia. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you live every Tuesday. And today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues, but I guess I will start in Sudan. It looks like they have a new sheriff or sheriffs in town. The coalition government finally agreed to form a sovereign council or sovereign government that is going to be run by about 11 people, including a prime minister. Shaka, your thoughts in Sudan?
Well, at least on paper, it looks very doable. It looks like it could very well be a successful transition, whether or not that results in an election that is not a selection remains to be seen. I say that especially because when you look at the new Sudanese Prime Minister, a Dr. ABDEL, I happen to know a little bit about him because he happened to be a friend of a mutual friend and a man that you knew, a Dr. Tajuddin Abdurrahim, a former Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, a former Secretary General for the Global Pan-African Movement based in Uganda for many, many years, a very proud Nigerian who happened to be really a great Pan-Africanist. Hamdok is someone that did his PhD in economical science at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. He's a guy who is in the military culture. When I was there, we would have described him as an officer and a gentleman. This man is a diplomat's diplomat, incredibly humble, very intelligent, very smart, a man who is incredibly experienced, both in terms of domestic administration in the context of Sudan, but also internationally. He worked at the African Development Bank in the senior, basically executive positions. Most recently, he happened to be the #2 man in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, at this ECA, the Economic Community for Africa. You know, this is the United Nations economic, kind of major, institution that is responsible for promoting development and all that kind of stuff. He is a man who is very highly respected, especially by those who have known him. They call him a true Pan-Africanist. They find him to be very environmentally friendly, and hence, in fact, they characterize him as someone that was remarkably humble, very disciplined, someone that was an excellent listener. So he's like someone, frankly, that if you are talking about Sudan needing some kind of political administrative medicine, he looks like he could very well be the medicine that the doctor may have actually ordered. The question is, how much wiggle room does he have? Does he in fact have power? Does he have authority to exercise? Can he exercise that authority? Or does he simply have a position? Others might call it a rank, because executive authority, executive power resides in the what they call
the
Sovereign Council,
headed by ABDEL FATTAH,
who happens to be a military general. But he will head it for the first part of the 3 years, and later, of course, it's going to be someone that happens to be a civilian. Now, the question is, how far will the Sovereign Council allow the Prime Minister to be himself, to wield power, to control his cabinet, and make sure that they do the right thing?
Shaka, like you correctly said that at the beginning, you said that power resides in the Sovereign Council, and you and I know that in most places, especially on the continent, prime ministers are just like really honorary titles. They don't mean much when it comes to the actual governing of the country. We've had countries where, unless in the country, like for example, Ethiopia, where the prime minister power resides in the prime minister's office, but in this particular case, you have so many people on that sovereign council who want to be part of, let's quote unquote, the power sharing agreement, and I don't think they're going to easily let that power go.
It is interesting that you raise that question. Yes, prime ministers sometimes may probably not have much power because, in fact, they are not elected by the people. They are appointed, for the most part, by the sitting or the incumbent presidents in a lot of situations on the African continent. But they are also the type of prime minister that actually has power, the type of prime minister that has executive power. And these are people that are generally elected by the people, and sometimes being in a country that runs on politically a parliamentary system, and they are heads of governments and all that kind of stuff, but not heads of state. Prime ministers, by the way, almost universally are never heads of state. I hear a lot of us, a lot of our journalistic tribes making a lot of mistakes, sometimes referring to prime minister as a head of state.
Head of government.
They are usually heads of government.
Right.
Heads of states are generally presidents and sometimes monarchs, queens, kings, emperors, and all that kind of stuff. For example, there was a very rather embarrassing situation in 1995 when Uganda was celebrating the NRM, I think almost, I guess, 10 years into power, because they came in 86. So this is 95. And he had two prime ministers. I am sorry to say that the president of Uganda at the time used a little bit of what I would characterize as undiplomatic language. He had his own prime minister, who was, I think, if I remember correctly, by the name Chintu Musoke. And then the guest of honor was the then Ethiopian prime minister, Meles Zenawi. And when he was addressing Meles Zenawi, he addressed him very, very nicely. He talked about how he is head of government and what have you. He is a real prime minister. But when it came to his own prime minister, Chintu Musoke, he said, no, this one is not a real prime minister like the other one. You know, that kind of stuff. I mean, he really meant, I think he meant well in the sense that he was essentially pronouncing out the differences in terms of the type of prime minister that Uganda had as opposed to the type of prime minister that, for example, Ethiopia enjoyed.
Let's do a quick follow-up. Let's hope the current prime minister in Sudan, who assumed office a few days ago, will not fall in the footsteps of former prime minister Chintu Musoke, who has referred to the Ugandan president as a person holding just the office of the prime minister. But quicker follow-up, what lessons can be learned from the experiment of Sudan, so to speak?
I think so far they have done a pretty good job, really, in the sense that they have also been helped, obviously, by, we have to give credit to Ethiopian Prime Minister, the incumbent Ethiopian Prime Minister, Dr. General Abiy Ahmed, because he was really the key mediator, if we can accept that word. And then, of course, he was backed by the African Union. So we have to give credit to the African Union. He was also in turn backed by the international community, including these United States where we are seated right here. Because in fact, they said they could only do business with a civilian-led administration, not a military junta, which is an idea that was actually supported by Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and some other, countries around Iraq and what have you, kind of stuff. So I think that so far, at least, the Sudanese people seem to be showing the way. They basically did the demonstration when those demonstrations were needed, and they paid a very, very heavy price.
7 months of demonstrations.
7 months of demonstrations, but eventually they pretty much won the battle. Now, can they, in fact, win the war? They can only win the war if, for example, following 3 years of a transitional government, you are, in fact, going to have an election conducted in a manner that fits the democratic threshold. An election that does not risk being called, for example, by some political pundits like me, called selections. An election whose results clearly are going to be reflecting the will of the people. The people, in fact, who go and cast the vote, but not the individual who is going to come up and announce the results, or the people who actually count the vote.
Speaking about the individual who actually announces the result, or the person who counts those votes that we are talking about, we had a similar situation in the Congo, DRC, where a lot of critics or a lot of people have said that that election or that win was handed over to President Tshisekedi, who, by the way, just announced a cabinet, and out of that cabinet, almost 42 ministers or deputy ministers are from Kabila's coalition party.
Not almost. In fact, you are right. It is 42. The last time I checked, out of 65, 2/3, in a way that it basically pretty much looks like there is some kind of invisible hand controlling the situation. Because in addition to what you just said about dominating the cabinet, because in fact, Felix Tshisekedi, the last time I checked, the number that is attributed to him, his allies, we are talking about, I was not a good mathematician, but in this particular case, I can do the math. 23, 23 actually are the ones that are associated with President, they call him Son Excellence, Felix Tshisekedi. And not to mention, by the way, that some of the most important dockets, we're talking about mining, for example. We're talking about finance. We're talking about foreign affairs, I think. So you can imagine, we're talking about defense. These essentially are held by allies of former DRC President Joseph Kabila. In addition, his allies control the National Assembly. And in fact, they won it by more than 70% poll, which means they actually could do anything with what is called the constitution. Almost, in fact, almost actually transforming the constitution into a sort of personal or party manifesto.
How would you respond to some of those critics who say former President Joseph Kabila was a genius? He displayed hallmarks of a genius in a sense that he was able to make this calculated move, planted this guy in, and short of that, they could have Congo would have ended up going into war. But somehow he figured out to negotiate his exit.
I think so far you probably could be on very firm ground by characterizing him as a sort of political genius in the Congo, especially because those types of elections that were in fact held that resulted in Felix Tshisekedi, a member of the opposition. Remember, his father was like a veteran opposition leader.
Correct.
A man who had been a couple of times prime minister under Mobutu Sese Seko Zabanga, but never could actually make it. You have a situation, for example, where Mr. Kabila was smart enough to know, to read the political temperatures and stay away from his own personal candidate, who was supposed to be representing his coalition of parties. And he said, I am not going to impose this man on the Congolese people. Mm. And somehow, he was obviously accused for having cut a deal with Felix Tshisekedi. And of course, that accusation has been denied by both sides. But when you look at the accumulating evidence, clearly you can see that Felix Tshisekedi, we are talking about a president. Yes, he can return salutes. He can take the presidential, honors and all that kind of stuff. But the question is, does he, in fact, other than being called His Excellency, the President, or in French they say son excellence, does he, in fact, wield power? Does he, in fact, own or have authority to move the mountains? The question seems to be no.
Well, Shaka...
But he has some wiggle room because at least so far he has done something that Joseph Kabila never did, which is, for example, pardoning some political prisoners, including Moise Katumbi, a former governor of Katanga, who, before the elections, was in fact barred from returning to the DRC on the grounds, by the way, that he actually owned dual nationality. One was, he had, of course, Congolese, and then, in addition, he had Italian. He was pardoned, forgiven, and came back, and there were also so many other opposition, members who had been in prison. He forgave them.
Right.
So there is something he has been able to do, at least in terms of symbolically, but can he, in fact, go beyond simply holding the ball?
But that shows that he has some power, so at least some semblance of power. The fact that he can ultimately decide who comes back to the country, that's power.
That's true too, but it could also very well be that in fact he had to probably negotiate that with President or former President Joseph Kabila.
Let's move on, Shaka. Let's go to our comments. Let's go to Muyinja Buyuka Vincent. Good evening, Shaka. Why is it that the media, especially international media houses, have negative attitude in reporting about Africa? I think they're talking about us here.
It is very interesting. In fact, part of the problem is that we African journalists do not do our homework. If we did our homework, we would be in a position of defending, for example, defending the integrity of the African personality. defending the culture of Africa, defending the dignity of the African people. But it could also help, for example, if we in fact had leaders who believed in their people, leaders who followed the rules, leaders who governed according to the constitutions. For example, when they come to power, they swear to uphold, to defend those very important documents. But unfortunately, when you look at the history of African politics, very few of them, in fact, go ahead and respect those documents. They transform those documents into what some pundits have, in fact, characterized as personal manifestos. They become personal manifestos, for example, because they don't even care about the entrenched aspects of the Constitution. If they want to change a Constitution so that they can, in fact, stay longer in power, they will go ahead and do it. If they want to remove the age cap, they will go ahead and remove it without consulting even their people. So you have a situation where the African leaders should learn very, very early that what they are supposed to be doing is in fact to be leaders of their people. And if you are a leader of your people, you cannot afford to be very far away removed from them. But what they have actually turned out to be are what some pundits call rulers, become African rulers. So I think two things here. We have to have good leadership. We have to have people who are socially and politically conscious, which means subjects, for example, like civic education could be very helpful so that populations can begin to understand what their powers are and what their role is in terms of being able to choose people who are going to govern them rather than to rule them. We also have to have an army of journalists, an army that is smart enough to know its history, smart enough to know its history and respect it, to know its culture, to know its politics. You know, it is very sad that we, for example, a lot of Africans have been independent for many decades right now, but the curriculum itself, what they teach to their kids and what have you, has hardly changed. Yeah. And so I cannot even remember when I personally came to the United States in 1976, when I enrolled at the State University of New York. I had a problem with somebody selling me the idea of studying about Africa, studying about myself. I was more than willing to continue studying what I had done back in Uganda, which was about Britain and the Commonwealth, studying about the American history, studying about anything but Africa. I am glad that the forces that were encouraging me and persuading me to grow up and wake up and respect who I am and my ancestors succeeded. And then, of course, you have the problem of the Western journalists. Western journalists, not all of them, but a good number of them tend to be very ignorant about the history of Africa, the cultures of Africa, the politics of Africa, and what have you. So I call it premeditated ignorance. They have that problem. But they also have an excuse, given that, as I said a little bit earlier, our leaders, most of them are not leaders. They are basically rulers. And so they provide the ammunition to some of these people who look at Africa through their own racial, cultural, social, ideological lenses of their own experiences.
Shaka, there is somebody who seems to agree with you, and in fact, he happens to be one of your fans. He says, Real Ronald says, Shaka's analysis is always spot on. He has taught us to appreciate politics from different perspectives. But sometimes, like he rightly says, he tends to take it on to our leaders in Africa, hold these leaders accountable to an extent that some feel that you are being partisan.
Well, I am being partisan. In fact, if somebody suggested that I was partisan, so long as I am partisan to the truth, the facts, I would consider that to be a badge of honor. We're talking about the truth here. We're talking about facts, not about personalities. I do not have problems with any particular single African individual who lives or resides in the state house of the capital of their country. What I have is the problem of the manner in which they execute, the manner in which they hold power, the manner in which they govern. And I think it is in the interest of all of us, really, because at the end of the day, we definitely need to have leaders, but we also have to know that the people that actually have power, and a lot of people in those positions have never forgotten that the saying that power belongs to the people. But it's just about talking the talk. But when it comes to walking that particular talk of actually power belonging to the people, they are missing in action. And I think part of the reason is because the people themselves are not ready. Because are not ready, they are ignorant of their power, because if they did, they would assert it. That is how, for example, we got a man called Marshal Omar Bashir out of State House, Khartoum. That is how we got a man called Handsome Blaise Compaoré in Burkina Faso out of office. And so the people have the power. If they know what they have, they can exercise it. Because at the end of the day, societies really have to depend on facts, on knowledge. Knowledge is power. It's not about whims, it's not about lies.
Shaka, on that note, I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, it's been a pleasure having you in studio. Until then, I'll see you next week on another edition of Shaka Extra Time.
I can't believe it was such a very short time.
Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Be a threat to our country. I am concerned about some of the more volunteering reporting structure that I heard about today, especially as we get down and down into having less personnel available to be and that are at a level of competency to be able to address those needs on an ongoing basis. And we have newer and newer energy sources coming online with much smaller budgets and getting into the grid than some of the other major competitors that are out there. So in general, I think this has been a good enlightening process today, but as far as enlightening me, it's been one that